Hey, let's talk about hips.
So your hips should be able to do many things, but two things I want to talk about today is about internal and external rotation. So internal rotation being your hip's ability to turn in, external rotation being your hip's ability to turn out. Why would you care about it? Well, maybe let me paint two scenarios, maybe one applies to you. One, if you squat in any way, shape, or form in a gym, you probably care about internal and external rotation. Because as we descend in a squat, what's happening in the hip is that my femur is externally rotating in order to allow me to get down here. If you don't have control of that external rotation, then a couple of things. One, it's going to limit how deep you can get in the squat, or you're going to have to do something else somewhere in order to create some space for you to get down into the bottom position. Internal rotation comes into play getting back up, because as I shoot myself back up, my femur is then relatively internally rotating compared to my pelvis. So if you were squat, potentially if it looks something like this, well then maybe that's a lack of internal hip control, and so your knees jut in because you can't control that internal rotation. Second scenario, if you like to run, running requires internal and external rotation of the hip as we're moving forward and backwards. So if I'm running, and let's see which way I want to show this. If I'm running away, my back step, there is relative internal rotation of my hip as I extend off that back foot. And then when I come through in the strike, I'm having more external rotation in the hip. If you don't have control over that internal rotation, then you're gonna have to buy yourself space somewhere else. So whether that's the ankle, or maybe the back, arching up as you're running, or doing something weird with your hip in order to give your body the ability to move your femur internally. So those two scenarios on things you might care about why your hip needs to have internal and external rotation. So what's some fun stuff you can do to work on that internal and external rotation? I'm going to talk about some internal stuff. From a FRC lens, you could do Pales rails. So what I set up here is incline bench, and I'm going to put my leg up on it because this is putting my hip in relative internal rotation, right? So if I give myself some space, I can internally rotate, which would look like picking the foot off, or if I wanted to externally rotate, that would look like lifting the knee off. Pales rails just basically means squeeze one way and then squeeze the other. And when we're in this position, we'll set ourselves up so that we're in quote unquote end range. So for me right here, I can't actually pick my foot up off the bench because I'm at my own end range of hip internal rotation. So what I would do for Pales or rails, so one contraction is going to be like I'm pressing my foot into the bench as if I was going to lift my knee up and off of it. And so I'm going to use all of my hip rotators to think about squeezing and peeling my knee up, 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 up. I'm not going to end up going anywhere, holding for whatever your kind of count is. And then rails would be squeezing and sending the other way, sending the knee into the bench, lifting the foot up and off. When I do Pales rail stuff, I usually do something like 3 sets of 10 seconds Pales, 10 seconds rails. Just as a general thing, that's what I do. Not saying that's what you would do. So that would be internal rotation work using Pales rails. So Pales rails is end range isometric work, meaning you're contracting but you're not going anywhere. You also want to add in work that's going to be movement, or your concentric and eccentric in those end range positions. Chris, how you doing?
Oh, yeah.
Good.
I heard somebody in here talking.
I'm talking to the internet.
And then I was like,
Nobody's out
I was
there.
out in the parking lot.
Yeah, just you and me. So setting up for end range movement with this for that internal and external rotation of the hip. Grabbing something stable like a rig, you'll keep this hip pelvis down, but you're gonna raise your hip up and give yourself some space here, because what we're gonna do is internal rotation, where I'm going to try to lift my foot out without hiking up the hip. So keeping the pelvis down, but turning out with the foot, and external rotation being lifting the foot up to the sky, squeezing adductors to get it there. And so you might do this after you do your pails or rails work, because you did your isometric and now you're doing your concentric and eccentric. So in other words, squeezing without moving and squeezing with moving. So if you run, you squat, care about moving your hips internally and externally, do some things. Try some FRC stuff. It's fun. Let me know how it goes.